Hi, I am Pratim Ranjan Bose, and you are watching Podcast with Pratim, presented by Iravati Research and Communication Center, or IRCC. Over the last few episodes, we discussed a range of topics starting from international affairs, security, geopolitics, connectivity to Make in India. In this episode, we will discuss about India's international trade and trade pacts, or what is popularly known as FTAs. I have with me Dr. Pritam Banerjee, Head of the Center for WTO Studies in Delhi. Set up in 1999, this think tank helps the government in framing trade policies and negotiating preferential trade agreements with different trade blocs or nations. Dr. Banerjee was earlier a senior director of Deutsche Post DHL Group. He had also served World Bank and was the head of trade policy of Apex Chamber CII. Welcome, Pritam. Let me start with the first question. With all the countries led by the US imposing tariff or non-tariff barriers on select countries, what is the weight of non-preferential free trade or MFN trade? What is the current share of FTA trade in India's total trade? And where do you expect it to go in the next 5 years? If the preferential trade is the way forward, what would be the role of WTO or World Trade Organization in the days to come?
First of all, thank you very much, Pratimda, for having me in this podcast. It's always a pleasure to have any interaction with you. Before I get into the question, just one actually quick addition to your introduction about the center. We not only support the government on FTAs and preferential agreements, we also support the government, as our name suggests, in multilateral engagement with the WTO. In fact, the name goes back to the time when WTO was the only game in town and we had not yet started this journey of FTAs that has become so important. So, and also please do excuse me, I'll look into a few notes just to make sure time to time that I'm putting the right numbers, which I have noted down based on your queries. So in terms of your first question, where you talk about the US imposing tariff on non-tariff barriers on select.
Every country is imposing. Every country is.
Every country is actually. Thank you. I was just going to make that point that it's not a US specific phenomena. Let me just explain. And this is my opinion. I must underline that at the outset. That you see, when we go back to the mid 1990s, and we are going back to the Clinton era in the US, where US was just after the Cold War the predominant economic and geostrategic power, and the force behind the WTO. The Uruguay round, in a sense, was led by the United States, and it went on to establish the WTO in 1995. And then subsequently, US was the biggest champion of getting China into the WTO. Now, please remember that China was not an original member of the WTO. So, as I was saying earlier, that, China was considered a non-market economy by all major, and still is, all major economies in the world. But at that time, when, President Clinton very aggressively pushed for inclusion of China in the WTO, the logic was that, opening up China to a market-led economic system and the economic success that would follow will actually lead to Chinese communism to collapse. That was the presupposition. I think it was
to be a little more precise, US was then all gaga about China and was trying to build trade and etc. So they roped them.
If you look, read people like Francis Fukuyama, that the man who coined that famous phrase, "end of history." The end of Cold War is the end of history, and this is the state of the world for forever to come. A very simplistic assumption again, but that was the assumption that the West had won and the market economy had won, and all we had to do was expose these countries to a market economic system, and eventually the political system itself will collapse in the weight of the economic transformation. A very simplistic assumption was made. But if you now, the critical point is still about the 2010. So the first 10 years of China joining the WTO and benefiting from WTO membership. you had a phase where the kind of products they were specializing in and creating overcapacity and breaking all rules of the WTO. But given the system was so opaque, the accountability was not there. Those products were basically the kind of products countries like India, Indonesia, Brazil produced. So the deindustrialization of these economies, thanks to China's unfair trade practices, was not impacting the US or the developed world because the Americans didn't care where the cheap t-shirt came from. In fact, cheaper was better. So if China was producing it cheaper using unfair practices, they didn't care because the job losses and the negative impact was coming to countries like ours. But from 2010 onwards, building on these huge economies of scale, they have now started around the time when Obama comes in his second term. They have started impacting those industries where the West is good at. Semiconductors, advanced electronics, solar, the whole green transition technology. So now, since the West started feeling the pinch, you have this coming back of protectionism, and protectionism is no longer a bad word. When in the 2000 in the early 2000s, when countries like India or Brazil would argue that we needed to protect our market precisely because this Chinese dragon, we were told that this is a very bad thing, and you're going back to protectionism and trust the free market, etc. But now, when their own house is on fire, they've forgotten all those sermons, and this is what has come back. So, essentially, what we were doing in 2010, so they are now doing along with us. So you can say that they have joined the club in some way. So. But then to answer your original question on MFN trade, well, MFN trade remains important. Let me give you, and that also answers your second question essentially. So if I look at the major economies, India's share of preferential trade is around 35 to 40% of its total trade. If I look at some of other more successful industrialized economies like South Korea, Australia, Japan, etc., their numbers are higher, between 70 to 80%. But then you have countries like Brazil, which is less than a quarter of its trade is preferential trade, and then larger economies like EU, US, etc., it's around the same share as India, between 35 to 40. Now, the dynamics of this is because, first of all of these countries have significant amount of trade with China, and most of them do not have a FTA with China and unlikely to have an FTA with China in the future. At least definitely, if I look at the big five economies, then India, EU, and US are unlikely to have a trade pact with China. Japan already has through RCEP, so in a sense, the large economic powers, most of them, I do not see having a trade pact with China in the near future. Now, going in the future, as you asked me, these shares will likely increase because India is negotiating trade pacts with the EU, which is a very important trading partner, probably will pursue a lot of other FTAs. So this 35-40 is likely to reach 60-65 over the next decade or so. EU's own share will increase because it's pursuing trade deals in many parts of the world. US has taken a step back. Whether or not that's a temporary step back, whether it's a more longer trend, we don't know. My own intuition is that once things stabilizes, US will be seeking trade pacts maybe in 5-6 years down the line with countries like India and others. So this is, I think, my prognosis going forward. But just to also quickly touch upon the why the multilateral trading system is important is because a lot of trade actually happens outside of FTAs, and those multilateral rules remain important for that reason. But the multilateral system itself is under a little bit of a threat, and that threat is again linked to the China story.
Please go
So
ahead.
the reason why is that if you see, and a lot of people unfairly blame President Trump for this. But the US saw this coming. If you see the literature around industrial policy and protectionism, which was considered very bad things, suddenly around 2010, 11, this is around the time Obama's second term. If you read some of the things coming out of Brookings Institution, Peterson Institute, the usual suspects in Washington, D.C., who reflect turn of thinking, suddenly they were saying, oh, industrial policy is all not that bad, relook all of these things. Along with that, President Obama said that he will not, basically, WTO is a consensus-based system, and the US refused to
certify the nomination of judges to the WTO appellate body. So the WTO dispute settlement mechanism,
So
which is the crown
essentially,
jewel of the WTO.
you are saying that multilateralism or WTO trade is not will be there, will remain
No,
there.
no, just let me complete the point. This is a well thought out policy, right, by the US and others. By scuttling the appellate body, which the US started doing during Barack Obama's time, much before Trump. Trump continued the same policy, and now Biden has continued. This is a bipartisan policy to scuttle the appellate body of the WTO. The dispute settlement mechanism, as I was saying, is the crown jewel of the WTO. It is the place where you take a dispute. So you have a two-tiered system. The first is the panel. If you don't agree with the panel ruling, you go to the appellate body. Now we don't have an appellate body because the US has scuttled it, which means countries can come up with whatever policies they want, which is completely in violation of WTO rules. And if they are large enough and big enough, get away with it. So because US was planning this transition, they knew in 2010 and 12 that some years down the line, I will violate WTO. I will bring all kinds of measures to protect my economy, to subsidize my industries, which might be questioned in the WTO, but I have destroyed the system anyway. So we have to fundamentally think that this is not something good. This is being done at the behest of a few countries. Countries like India still need an open multilateral system, which gives a greater deal of fairness. And as I said, a lot of the trade actually happens under multilateral rules, and they will continue to happen in the future as well.
But there is another side of the story in terms of now. Let me come to FTAs. India doesn't really have a great experience with FTAs. There were many reported loopholes in the, say, for example, India-ASEAN FTA. Even SAFTA had some loopholes in the country of origins clause, as some quarters pointed out. FTA utilization, you said it has been low. Now, there was some report that is saying that between 2017 and 22, India's exports to its FTA partners increased by 31%, while the imports increased by 82%. To put it simply, is that FTAs are helping the other nations when India, insofar as India's FTAs with the world economy, it is the other nation which is more benefited. That is the general consensus. Now, how do you justify this? Is it merely due to India's lack of export capacity or failure of the Indian negotiators in pursuing national interest?
So let me first I want to give you a nuanced answer based on some economic logic, right? So FTAs essentially are signed with comparative advantages of both countries kept in mind. And the negotiators do as good a job as possible with as much research as possible to identify which lines or which products they will liberalize the tariffs for imports, and for which products they will demand liberalization of duties on the other side to ensure that our exporters gain the most. Now, the success of an FTA is not dependent only on the fact that tariffs have been reduced in some market, because you will always be competing with other countries for that market for market share for those products. Now, it so happened, if you look at trade data, is the time we generally negotiated our FTAs when they came into force, which is between 2005 and 12 and 13. If I look at my main generation 2 trade agreements with, so if you look at our, that generation of agreements which came into force, Korea, Malaysia, Japan, Singapore, India, ASEAN Trading Goods Agreement, all of those agreements came into force between 2005 and 10, 11, around that time. That is also the time when China's share of global manufacturing market grew exponentially. So in every one of these markets, we were competing with China. Whether or not China had an FTA didn't matter. They were using a number of, as I mentioned earlier, they had economies of scale, no doubt, but they were also using unfair trade practices to gain market access in all of these countries. So the success of an FTA should not be judged by the fact that whether or not you expanded your exports. In many cases, if you manage to hold your existing share in that market, despite the huge competition from China, that is also a success, because that reduction in tariff allowed you to handle that massive competition from China in those markets for your exporters. Yes, we could have done better in some cases, and I will come to that reason maybe in a later, once we discuss more on the linkages of policy. But the second point is that my own consumption, if you look at that, this is the time starting from 2010 9 onwards, when my own middle class grew and my consumption grew. So my needs for energy, my needs for various other things expanded rapidly. So let us take the India-ASEAN, which is the most castigated trade agreement, as a case to the point. What are the goods that are driving my negative balance of trade? What are those imports? Most of those imports are the ones that bulk explains the bulk of the negative balance of trade, are petroleum and petroleum products. It is coal, it is wood and timber, it is palm oil, and it is electronic goods, right? These five products. The first four are, anyone who has basic understanding of industrial value chains will know, is linked to my growing consumption. Palm oil for processed food, cosmetics, coal, petroleum, natural goods for my energy and other, raw material requirements. Electronics, of course, is because the middle class consumption market was growing for these products, the final goods. But now with PLI and other schemes, lot of your intermediates for which you need to produce final goods in India, a smartphone or a refrigerator, which many of which we are now exporting the final good as value addition, the intermediates are coming from Southeast Asia. So you need to import them to export, right? So this negative balance of trade not is always a bad thing.
No, I think
A very
the criticism came in the wake that a lot of it was easier to import final products than bringing in the inputs and make the final product. So that was generally the criticism.
I think that is a more holistic policy question. It's a very good point, but I think we should take it up perhaps subsequently in the discussion, where we open it up to a larger debate on trade policy. But just quickly on the rules of origin, a lot of people have also mentioned rules of origin to be a problem, right? And they have said that perhaps the rules of origin are not adequate, that we have not negotiated our rules of origin adequately. I would argue that, in fact, the criticism from the trade policy world across the trade policy ecosystem is that India negotiates very tough rules of origin. In fact, they are so tough and complicated, it's difficult to, comply with it. That is not been the problem. The problem is that, if enforcement of rules of origin is a very difficult business. You might have a very tough rules of origin to ensure that they are being actually adhered to. Requires a lot of institutional capacity. It also requires a more, I would say, nuanced approach, which we are kind of still not perfected. So you need to follow data, you need to follow industrial trends in your partner countries, you need to have risk management systems which enable you to spot immediately when you have your import data, to gauge that, okay, this import that I am getting from my FTA partner country could not have originated in that country. There is something going on here, and I immediately, push for accountability from my trading partner. So if you do that in a robust manner, you will be able to stop any significant violation. There are always some loopholes, but I think that system we are yet to perfect, the enforcement aspect of rules of origin.
So I think what you are essentially saying is that, probably we need far more a practical approach in framing those things. Or I think
Absolutely. We need more practical rules of origin, which might not always have to be so complicated, but at
you
the
have to
same
look at
time,
it from implementation point of view rather than mere,
yes, and make it
textbook.
much more robust in terms of its implementation. Absolutely.
Now, the next question. India signed some 13 or 14 trade agreements in last 5 odd years.
Mm-hmm.
And many more are coming. We are moving from, apparently that is the picture that we are getting, that we are moving from the free trade pacts to comprehensive economic partnership agreements. which covers wider areas, including investment, etc. Now, India-UAE has been a major pact that was signed in May 2022, exactly 2 years ago. So it's too early to judge its performance, but so far it is, there is no one-sided growth. Are the new pacts any better in terms of this implementation, which you are referring to, than the older ones? And over to you.
Right. No, definitely, you would agree, Pratimda, that there is an element of learning by doing in everything. So, as we have negotiated more and more agreements, our negotiators and our systems have gotten better at doing it. But just to go back to the point of, the comprehensive agreements, first of all, the reason we are signing comprehensive agreements is because our interest or our aggressive interest for exports have expanded.
Exactly.
Second, the world that we are living in is no longer simply defined by tariffs. It is defined also by a lot of non-tariff barriers, which we have to comprehensively address, which comprehensive agreements allow you to do. Simplistic preferential agreements don't. We also have aggressive interest in services, including a lot of new age services, cross-border delivery of services, digital services, all of which can only be handled in a comprehensive agreement. It cannot be done in a simplistic preferential agreement. More importantly, I think in the case of UAE, success relatives, of course, as you pointed out, is to perhaps a little early, but if the early trends hold to, look at UAE's, India-UAE success, it reflects that our own economy is maturing. And our own ability to penetrate markets and use FTAs is also maturing. And this is a good trend. Why it is doing so, again, I will hold back till we go into a larger debate on trade policy as a whole. This is a very specific answer. I just want to come back to the investment aspect that you raised. Let us be very clear, Pratimda, that India does not include investment in its trade agreement, even in its comprehensive agreement.
Achha.
We have chosen to, go the bilateral investment treaty route, and we have, kind of annulled all our most of our old BITs, and we are expected to, we are expecting to negotiate new ones. This is a criticism. There is a strand of thought which argues that this is a wrong approach because the trade and investment linkage is massive, and perhaps this is a something that have to be looked into. But we have actually done, and I want to make this point before we move on to the next question. Something very unique in the India FTA TEPA is the first trade agreement in the world which has explicitly linked investment outcomes by the partner country to the market access. The reason that we have done it is because, see, one of the most important criticisms of negotiating a trade agreement between a developing country and a developed one is that developed countries typically tend to have very low MFN applied tariffs. So, they will be 2.5%, 2%, 1.5%, trivial tariffs. So, if you go from that to zero, your marginal improvement in market access is not that much. Now, a developing country like India would typically tend to have much higher average applied MFN tariffs, 7%, 10%. So, if I go from that to zero, the developed country gets a huge boost in terms of the market access to my market. So, it's just because of this structural challenge, you will always be a loser in a tariff-based negotiation. You will give up much more because you are starting from high tariffs vis-a-vis the other country. So in the India FTA TEPA, what I think India has really kind of done an innovation that is probably going to be emulated by other developing countries. We have made this point and we have said that we are not really gaining much because Switzerland and other FTA countries have very low tariffs anyway. That we link it that over a period of 10-15 years, in lieu of our opening up our market to your industries, you commit to making an investment of $100 billion and create jobs over here. And if over 15 years it doesn't play out, then we will have the right to take away the market access rights we have offered to you. So the success of the agreement has been defined as market access for your industries, but also investment in return in my economy by your industries, because especially for developed countries, that is what we are very keen on, to have that FDI come in, the technology come in, the manufacturing come, come into my country to create the jobs that I need. Whether or not this structure will succeed remains to be seen, but the fact that we innovated this and we have negotiated this successfully, we have convinced EFTA to accept this, is, I think, a landmark in its own way.
So here lies a question. Say, for example, India, UK, or EU FTA that you have been talking about, negotiating. Now, it is a matured market. We cannot expect a huge push in exports. It's a quite competitive and matured market. The attraction lies in UK's position as the flow of investment. To my mind, UK is very important in terms of FDI and other things. Now, if investment is not linked to this paradigm, then how are we, having a holistic policy, holistic pact?
That's again, Pratim, a very valid question, the question that a lot of people are asking. Of course, one model is the EFTA model. To what extent we can take this model to other countries remains to be seen. But there are developed countries who have, it's not all their tariffs are trivial. There are sectors where they still have high tariffs. The MFN applied tariffs are high, especially in sectors of interest to India, in certain chemicals, textiles. So that extent, this is an important aspect. I don't know if we have. So to that extent, it's an important. But of course, you are absolutely right. The investment linkage is paramount, and I think Korea shows the way.
Just hold on.
Very.
Just hold on. Repeat that part. Investor investment is paramount.
So the linkage between investment and trade is a paramount aspect that we need to obviously take into consideration. And as I was saying, the India-Korea FTA is a case to the point. The way the Koreans have used their agreement with us, they used the fact that they will have now zero duty access to Indian markets, and also ASEAN has a zero duty access in many goods of interest to the Indian market, to locate their manufacturing facilities here in electronics, in automobiles, and create that value chain. And when that scale has grown, the Koreans are now using India as a base to export. So that is clearly illustrative of this trade and investment linkage.
Right. So that's clearly an outlook that I think the audience would love to have, that how trade is not an isolated element. It is linked to your growth story very much. You need to have inputs at lower cost and should get the opportunity, ideally, to export the finished products. Now, that is, see, India's, you said in during the course of this discussion about India's new export ambitions, which is linked to India's manufacturing ambitions and growth ambitions and those things. So Nomura predicted that India's exports will be doubled from above $400 billion to above $800 billion by 2030. How much of it should come through the FTA route? And what should be the projected FTA utilization rate that you are looking at personally? Is there a scope to redo some of the old FTAs that we have? Say, for example, a lot of questions on this Indo-ASEAN.
Right. So let me take those individual strands independently. I think, as I said, that as we sign more and more agreements, including with the larger economies like EU, UK, which are all under negotiation, and of course we increase the ambition in other agreements like India, ASEAN, India, Japan, India, Korea, which are all under review at this point in time. We will probably hit about 60 to 65% of our trade, at least coming from FTAs by 2030, 35. This is a very subjective assessment, very top of the line numbers. But one could imagine that situation to be true. Now, in terms of the utilization rate, there is definitely room for improvement. largely because a lot of our MSMEs, who also are important exporters, are often unaware of the benefits of the FTAs. So that is something as a work in progress. I think the Ministry of Commerce, especially under this government, has made it a point to have very focused MSME outreach and engagement, and we will see utilization rates improve in the future, especially given the digitalization of the economy, where a lot of the processes, etc., are becoming much more easy to do in order to utilize FTA benefits. For getting a rules of origin certificate, for example, the ease of doing business is increasing rapidly. But to go back to the redoing of these agreements, surely there is a scope. The India-ASEAN trade in goods agreement is now being reviewed. So yes, scope is definitely there. Again, it's a matter of negotiation to what extent we can use that scope. But the government is fully seized of that matter. It realizes that there are things that could be done to improve these FTAs to enable our exports grow faster, and that will be looked into. But I would like to make a bigger point, Pratim, if I may, is that the whole competitiveness of your exports is a symphony with many players. It's not a single solo performance. Now, I think the UPA time, when a lot of these negotiations were thought, because trade FTA is a tool. It's a tool to open market access and then get you something, give something in return. You need to have two other players in that symphony. One player is your industrial policy, well thought out with substantial backing. The third player is the ease of doing business for the investment linkage. So I might have a very large market and I might have an FTA, but it is very difficult, complicated to come and do business over here. And FDI will not come to the extent it should. And it will definitely not grow in scale and scope to mature from just a market-seeking FDI to a efficiency-seeking FDI. So we have seen in the last 10 years huge improvements in user doing business, and the FDI numbers show that. Also, we have put in place as a country a much more ambitious industrial policy than we have had for a very, very long time, which is market-led. So now that we have this symphony instead of the solo player trying to, then I think the symphony will lead to success, and it is leading to success. So let not the history when I did not have the symphony be the predictor for my future performance, because now every country which succeeded, whether it's Korea or Japan, or in the earlier phases, the Europeans, they all had this symphony in place. The economic literature is replete with comprehensive reporting of this symphony. It is not unknown to any mainstream economist. Somehow, a lot of mainstream economists do not talk about it when they critique or either for or against FTAs. It comes down to that one number. Now that we have symphony in place, you will see a much greater success for India.
Thank you. I think what I get out of this for audience is that, number one, FTAs, the quality of in qualitative terms, the FTAs are India's performance in FTAs, signing FTAs has been increasing, as Pritam spoke about India-Korea FTA, the ongoing discussion with UK. So these are developed economies. We are dealing with them. So we are learning, kind of getting the expertise. The issue is about connecting all the dots, making it a part of your whole industrial policy growth paradigm, not looking at it in an isolated manner. We are very used to talk about international trade from a silo point of view, which it is not. So that side has to be far more, has to improve as the investment part is talked about. And we are surely expecting better performance and more cohesiveness, which is, let us give the devil its due, which is one of the parameters that make China a China.
Absolutely.
Thank
Or
you.
Japan before that.
Japan before that. In fact, all the Southeast Asian economies are like that. Very, very performance driven.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for giving time.
No, pleasure always mine, Pratimda. Thank you for having me. Have a good day.